Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing what role and impact the media has on shaping public opinion and attitudes towards Israel, and in particular Israel's recent conflict against Hamas in Gaza. We'll also be discussing how Israel faces a media war and how in that media war there's a real battle for truth, and we'll be asking how Israel can actually convey her message and actually win this very important war in terms of truth and public opinion. And in today's programme, I'm joined by Simon Plosker, who's the managing editor of Honest Reporting. Simon, it's good to have you back on the Middle East Report, and it's our first programme with our new set here in London.
Nice to be back, Simon.
That's good. Simon, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What led you to really get involved in fighting misinformation, misreporting regarding Israel, and what led you to work for Honest Reporting in Jerusalem?
Well, I was a student activist many, many years ago, and of course a lot of anti-Israel activity takes place on campuses, not just in Britain but around the world. So I had a background there, and I found my way working for the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is the umbrella organisation, representative organisation of British Jewry. And I was in the Public Affairs Department, and this was around 2000, the year 2000, at the outbreak of the so-called Second Intifada, the terrorist violence that was unleashed against Israeli civilians. And at the very same time, the media in Britain was absolutely appalling towards Israel. And I used to take a lot of phone calls from irate members of the public. You know, what are you going to do about the BBC? What are you going to do about The Guardian, etc., etc.? And it took me a while, but I realised they were asking the wrong question, because the question really should have been, what can we do about the media here? And I took that with me, and I moved to Israel in the year 2001. And eventually, in the year 2005, after working for a number of non-profits, I was hired by Honest Reporting to be their managing editor. And Honest Reporting's entire ethos is really based about what the ordinary person, the ordinary member of the public can do to defend Israel against media bias.
And can you tell us something about why Honest Reporting was set up and the very important work being carried out by Honest Reporting?
Well, Honest Reporting was actually set up in the year 2000, 2001, I think. But a couple of students actually in a flat, an apartment in Golders Green, northwest London, a couple of Jewish students, they were really, really fed up with the media coverage of Israel. And they got together an email list where they basically just started sending out alerts to their friends, telling them to respond to media bias. And this was in the days when email was maybe a sophisticated medium of communication, not so much now. But then, of course, it really was the best way to do this online. They grew the list, and eventually it grew so big that they actually had to hand it off to a Jewish outreach organisation, which seeded it and let it grow to become its own independent organisation with charitable status in America and Israel, independent of the Israeli government, editorially independent, based on donations from ordinary people and advertising. And Honest Reporting has now grown over the last, over a decade now. We have some 150,000 subscribers worldwide. And, it's a very successful operation, the largest grassroots organisation dealing with anti-Israel media bias today.
And what's been response from some of the mainstream media? I know that from going through your website, you've put a lot of spotlight on the BBC, on CNN, on Reuters, The Independent, and others. What has been the response from these media corporations?
Well, I'm quite sure that quite a lot of them don't like us. And you know what? I don't care, because if they don't like me, it means I'm doing my job. It means I'm holding them to account. And I hear anecdotally that whilst a lot of them don't like us, they at least respect us. And it keeps them on their toes. And it means they're not going to get away scot-free with publishing anti-Israel stuff, things that are inaccurate, demonizing Israel, And we certainly we play a very, very key role in educating the public as well to hold these media organisations to account.
Excellent. Now, it's been over 3 months since Israel launched Operation Pillar Defense, in which Israel responded to the thousands of rockets and missiles being fired upon southern Israel, which really affected up to about 1.5 million Israelis living in southern Israel. Looking back at that conflict now, how do you see that conflict was seen through the prism of the world's media?
I think we perhaps reached a turning point. I don't believe that that the media is suddenly going to become best friends with Israel. That's not going to happen. But in terms of how Israel was able to portray her own battle, I think it was very, very much an improvement over previous operations. Very much so. I think what made a very big difference was preparation. I think we learnt a lot from previous operations such as Cast Lead, the back end of 2009. And this time round, I do remember that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, he sat down the diplomats, the ambassadors from Western countries, and told them about the situation that was pretty much unbearable for the south of Israel. We had hundreds of Hamas rockets flying over from Gaza, making life unbearable for our citizens. And this couldn't continue. And I do believe that when the operation was launched, it made a big difference to have the leaders of Western nations coming out publicly and saying Israel has the right to defend itself. And from there, of course, it sets the tone for how the media was reporting as well. So, of course, preparation was very much key. Also, I think that was key was this was possibly the first conflict in the world that has also been fought on social media, almost in real time. We had the IDF using sophisticated means on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. In fact, the start of the operation where the arch-terrorist Ahmed Jabari was the victim of a targeted killing, this was actually announced on Twitter, almost live, within minutes of it happening. And from then on, the IDF managed to fill the vacuum, if you want to put it that way, with information in real time, which made a big difference because it meant that the other side was unable to fill those airwaves with their own misinformation.
And let's remind ourselves of that conflict that occurred over 3 months ago, which was a very, very tense time in Israel, as Israel responded from the barrage of rockets and missiles being fired upon southern Israel from the terrorist organization Hamas based in Gaza.
The Israeli military rushed a 5th Iron Dome anti-missile battery into service on Saturday and deployed it in the Tel Aviv area after Hamas militants in Gaza fired multiple rockets at the financial capital. The Iron Dome missile defense shield wasn't scheduled to come into service until early 2013, but because Tel Aviv was targeted with long-range rockets for the first time last week by Gaza militants, the army fast-tracked its deployment. The Israeli military has reported it shot down more than 240 incoming rockets, more than half the number of projectiles launched into Israel since this latest attack started, with Iron Dome scoring a 90% success rate of rockets it has been launched at. Israel's Minister of Civil Defense, Avi Dichter, and Mayor Ron Huldai have visited a so-called Situation Room in Tel Aviv, designed as a base to monitor the situation in Israel's largest city, and stress the importance of the missile defense system.
Here it happened from time to time in Tel Aviv. We have faced 2 rockets. Both didn't hit inside the city. So there is a probability, a slight probability that it will hit inside Tel Aviv. The Iron Dome brings down this probability to a very small probability. But, you know, you cannot play games even if it's a very small, a very poor probability. You have to be in the shelter.
Iron Dome has been operational since 2011, with currently 5 batteries deployed in Israel, most near the Gaza Strip. Each interception missile costs around $40,000, with the US providing $200 million in 2010 to expand development. The system's allowing Israeli citizens to go about their lives with a degree of normality.
The life in Tel Aviv goes on. You go in the street, everything is as usual. Thank you.
After they deployed the battery here, it feels much more comfortable, even though we hope that the rockets will not get all the way to us. But it feels much healthier and more comfortable to know that you have this kind of umbrella, such as the Iron Dome.
Israel's been bombarded by hundreds of rockets since it launched Operation Pillar of Defense on Wednesday to crush Hamas's rocket launching capability. The Iron Dome missile defense shield is one of the tools Israel has to stop Gaza rockets from landing on Israelis.
Police report. We saw in that clip what Israel had to endure those 3 months ago in Israel's war against Hamas. Simon, what do you believe are the challenges and difficulties that Israel faces when she launches such a military operation against Hamas, as we saw with Operation Pillar of Defense, knowing that Israel's under the full microscope of the world's media?
Well, I think the first thing to say is we're dealing with a form of asymmetric warfare. And Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations operate from within civilian areas, which means, of course, that you can't just roll in the tanks, you can't just launch indiscriminate bombing. Israel does not target civilians, full stop. Obviously, one of the challenges is to make sure that the amount of civilian casualties is as low as possible. Obviously, the other side doesn't care. The more civilian casualties on the Israeli side, the more that Hamas would be celebrating. Israel doesn't operate that way, of course. So we have that problem there. Of course, the other issue is that the other side, the Palestinian side, is very, very good at using the media to portray Israel as an aggressor. So, for example, you see the photos, the pictures, the images coming out of Gaza, people being led into hospital, buildings being blown up. It's not pleasant. War is not a pleasant thing. The images are very, very disturbing. Of course, on the other side, if you're looking for, who is the victim in all this? Well, of course, Israel is a victim of hundreds and hundreds of rockets, but thankfully, Israel is much better prepared for these things. Our civilians will go into bomb shelters, sealed rooms. We have warning siren systems. But I think as well it's very, very difficult for people to imagine what it's all about unless they've seen it. I actually took a trip to Sderot, which is just outside the Gaza border. I went on an organised trip with a number of foreign journalists, and we actually went to the landing site of a Hamas rocket. It landed in the middle of a street in a residential neighborhood. There was a crater on the floor, windows blown out, and quite surreal almost. An 8-year-old Israeli boy walking around with the back end of a rocket, very proud that he picked up this rocket. So the press are taking photos of all this. And then all of a sudden, the alert goes off. And in Sderot, you have 15 seconds to take cover. That's not a lot of time. And literally, everyone's scattered. We ran into the nearest house, the nearest apartment building that had actually already been damaged by the previous rocket launch. And I find myself with a bunch of journalists running through someone's living room and into the sealed room, which is a kid's bedroom. And it's like all these journalists are crammed into the room, and it's, whose room is this? One Israeli child sort of puts their hand up. It's my room. It's like, oh, thank you very much. So, it does make a difference, I think, for the journalists to know what's going on. I think another thing in the past that's happened is that Israel has not allowed the journalists free access into Gaza, not because they wanted to cover up things, but because for their own safety, for operational concerns. Israel does not want to accidentally kill journalists who happen to be running around looking for a story. Last time in Operation Cast Lead in 2009, the journalists actually sat on a hill in Sderot overlooking Gaza, tapping their heels and getting more and more irate. This time, Israel, I think, rightly let the journalists in, and this meant that the film footage coming out of Gaza was not from Palestinian stringers, and it wasn't from Al Jazeera, and I think we got a much more accurate representation of what was actually going on the ground.
So going back to the interesting story you had there with the foreign journalists in the safe bedroom, as it were, in Sderot with so many foreign journalists, could they then emphasise more with the residents of Sderot, with what they have to go through in terms of the rockets and missiles that fall on that town?
Well, I think it would be particularly strange if they weren't able to at least empathise with the residents there, you know, having been caught in a rocket attack themselves. Of course, it goes the other way as well. You know, journalists who are perhaps running around Gaza and seeing scenes of destruction there will, of course, also feel something for the civilian population. And equally, Israelis also feel for the civilian population of Gaza because they are also victims of a Hamas leadership that really doesn't care about their own people.
Yeah. But if we look back at Operation Defensive Pillar now, when Israel launched that operation, it became an international news story. All the journalists around the world followed that story. But if we compare that to what's happening in with one of Israel's neighbours, which is Syria, in which the UN have estimated there's been 70,000 people killed in that conflict so far, there's been very, very little news coverage. Why is it that Israel appears to be more of a focus of news attention rather than our Arab neighbours?
Well, I think there is for sure a double standard going on here. However, it's not really that simple because there's a lot of question about access. Journalists, obviously, a lot of their Middle East bureaus are based in Jerusalem. Why? Because Israel's a free country where journalists can write what they want, they can travel wherever they want. Now, if a journalist is in Syria or other neighbouring countries, then perhaps they would have a minder with them from the government. They're not free to report what's going on there, and that's in normal times when we don't have a civil war going on in Syria, for example. And, of course, a journalist who wants to keep their access is not going to write a particularly bad piece about the government of that country, because the next time they want a visa to get in there, they're not going to get that visa, at which point being the head of the Middle East Bureau is well, it's kind of irrelevant if you can't actually travel to a number of Middle East countries. So journalists are very, very careful about how they report on other countries. I also think that there's actually a form of inverse racism going on here, that Arabs killing Arabs is almost expected. So when you see, you know, hundreds and hundreds or thousands even of Syrians dying in a civil war there, victims of a brutal regime, people just see it as, they don't relate to it and they think that's what goes on in the Middle East. But of course, you get one Palestinian prisoner dying in an Israeli prison, and all hell breaks loose in the media. Now, I'm not saying that Israel's perfect, but you know, at least judge Israel by the sort of standards that you would expect of any other Western country. Having said that, I don't want to be compared to a regime next door like Syria or Saudi Arabia or other Arab states or Iran, because Israel is better than that. However, we should be judged by the same standards as any other Western liberal democracy.
I mean, I came back from Brussels yesterday. I filmed my programme, the European Report, in the European Parliament. So I took the Eurostar, came back, was on the Underground. So when I was at St Pancras Station, I picked up the Evening Standard. And I was just going through the paper. I usually go to relax, go to the sports pages first, particularly like you probably as well, interested in the football. But just look through some of the news stories. And then I found a very interesting story that was almost in the middle towards the end of the newspaper, a story about how the Syrian military fired ballistic missiles and killed over 141 people yesterday, including 71 children. This was according to the Human Rights Watch. And yet you compare this coverage of what's happening in Syria to what happens when Israel confronts Hamas in Gaza, for example. It'd be on the front page. So why is it we're seeing such a disproportion of news coverage condemning Israel, and yet there's virtually silence by the international community and the world's media about what's happening in Syria, which is horrific?
You're right. I mean, I have to ask the question, where is the outrage? Because it is outrageous what's going on in Syria. You know, people are dying in their hundreds each day, and the international community is doing very, very little. And at the same time, you still have the media concentrating a lot of its focus on what goes on in Israel. Israel is constantly being criticised for anything that it does in the self-defence of its own people, because that really is what it's about. Obviously, you know, it's perfectly legitimate to criticise Israel in terms of government policies that you may disagree with. That's perfectly fair. but at least don't go beyond legitimate criticism into areas of demonization and perhaps even anti-Semitism. I believe that if Syria really should be treated as an outrage that's what's going on there now.
Going back to some of our international media corporations, Simon, why do so many of them fall for the lies, the misinformation, and even the stage management of some of their productions just in order to convey misinformation and lies to the mainstream media?
I think a lot of the journalists turn up in Israel or report on Israel with very preconceived notions, a lot of prejudice there. So it fits a story. The story for the media is a very black and white one, a David and Goliath story, where in this particular case, Israel is portrayed as the Goliath and the Palestinians as the little David. So it's a very difficult situation. I also think that the messaging that comes out of Israel is not necessarily that clear. Of course, it's very difficult to explain 4,000 years of Jewish history in their land. It's much easier for Palestinians to come out with one particular message that resonates, for example. How many times have you seen Palestinian spokespeople go on television and say it's all about settlements, it's all about occupation? It's a very, very simple thing to do. Of course, the situation is much more complicated than that, and a lot of the time the media tend to ignore Jewish rights in the region. All I have to do really is start digging with my hands in the earth somewhere in Israel, and I will dig up the remnants of my ancestors from the last couple of thousand years. It's an amazing place. I'm not saying that, of course, Palestinians don't have rights. Palestinians, of course, do have rights, but it's it's not a very, very simple story that can be portrayed in a couple of 100 words on an article, or even 140 characters in a tweet, for example.
Yeah, we've got this clip to go to now that really does look at how some instances that are covered by our mainstream media have actually been stage managed, and we've got this clip now. Welcome back to the Middle East Report. We've got another clip to go to, which we're going to go to very shortly, Simon, which shows BBC hostility. Now, I know that for many Israeli spokesmen, when they go either on BBC or they go on Sky, or in particular the BBC, they get a very tough time. But the BBC seems to take a very hostile stance towards Israel in their reporting. Why do you feel this is the case?
I think there's a built-in structural bias within the BBC. It's not just about Israel. It manifests itself politically. Even I think a lot of BBC journalists would say that that there is a left-wing liberal slant in a lot of their reporting. A lot of their particular employees come from a certain background. And it means that it's very almost monolithic in that sense. Of course, that again is very simple to say because the BBC is a huge organisation with many, many employees. But certainly we've definitely had problems with the BBC newsroom, very much so.
And we got this clip to go to now that just shows you some of the hostility that Israel faces from many who are reporters and journalists who are working for the BBC.
I believe that Ban Ki-moon and Hillary Clinton wouldn't be coming here if not to close the deal. Netanyahu has been working on it with the Egyptians for a few days now. The Egyptians seem willing to play a role in Gaza in making sure that there wouldn't be rocket fire upon Israeli civilians. Israel can't trust Hamas to guarantee that, but it can trust Egypt, which has a lot to lose from the United States if they don't succeed. And so that brings in an element that there wasn't before that could allow Netanyahu to declare victory to the people of Israel.
But what will this have achieved? And once we get a ceasefire, as clearly everyone hopes we will, what will it have achieved for Israel?
Well, the whole goal was to achieve quiet in the south. You know, Israelis have been running for their lives there for 10 years. If that can stop even for a few months, then that is a big achievement. And having Egypt involved, which means having America involved, that's a guarantee that there never was before. If you can have somebody responsible, not a terrorist organization, who's there making sure that the people of Gaza are helped. Remember, the whole goal here for Israel, we want the people of Gaza to be helped and not to suffer under the terrorist leadership that they have there. Then that's good for Israel and that's good for the Palestinians, and so hopefully that can happen by the end of the day.
You say Israelis have been running for their lives from rockets fired from Gaza. So tell me then, until this current confrontation, how many Israelis have been killed by these rockets from Gaza this year?
Well, you know the numbers don't matter. The fact that Israel has shot down
I think the numbers do matter. Do you know the answer to this? How many Israelis had died this year?
No, I really know that it doesn't matter, ma'am.
No, well, why does it not matter?
I can tell you that Israel shot down hundreds of them. Each one of those rockets could have killed 5 people.
How many Israelis were killed? No, but how many Israelis were actually killed by these rockets?
Do you know the math? Assume that every rocket can kill 5 people. And there have been more than 700 fired since last week.
That was not my question.
The fact that Israel's protecting its citizens a lot better than any other country is, Israel has no reason to apologize for that, the same way that England and every other country wouldn't apologize for protecting its citizens well.
Well, you're either unwilling or are unable to give the answer to that question. So let me tell you, The Economist says
because it's irrelevant,
since 2004, well, that's your view, but we're trying to bring this story to our audiences around the world. Since 2004, according to The Economist, 20 Israelis were killed by rockets that came from Gaza into Israel. And this year, not one Israeli was killed by these rockets until this current confrontation began. Do you accept those figures?
Michelle, I would like you to see what it's like to be stuck in a room where you can't leave with your children for hours on end, that at any given moment a siren will go off that can go through your roof. The fact that Israel has managed to stop that from happening using defensive measures has prevented war, has prevented a lot of people from being killed on both sides.
Or certainly you could argue, couldn't you, that Hamas was also stopping worse happening all of this period, because although there were rockets being fired, they weren't the big rockets that have caused damage in recent days. They were mostly homemade contraptions.
Because Israel, at the beginning of right after they killed Jabari, the Hamas general, they went and they destroyed the long-range missiles that Hamas had. Otherwise, the damage would have been much more. Hamas was trying to kill civilians with every single rocket that they fired. And the fact that they didn't succeed, the fact that Hamas is a failure over the past week is a very good thing for both sides.
Not all of them were fired by Hamas, were they? I mean, you know that, and I know that. Hamas is not the only group that's operating in Gaza.
But Hamas is in charge of Gaza. Hamas overthrew the rightful Palestinian leadership there, and since then has made life a living hell for their people as well as ours.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Simon, what did you make of that clip there, which seemed a very, very hostile interview, and the BBC presenter there and journalist there wasn't so much interested in the facts, but really just wanted to make political capital out of the number of Israelis that were killed, ignoring the fear factor involved in these missiles and ignoring the fact that it actually paralysed over 1.5 million Israelis from going about their ordinary lives, going to schools, kids going to schools and going to jobs and what have you.
Well, I think you just said it very well, very well. I mean, it's an astonishing piece of footage because Gil Hoffman, the guest there, is the political editor for the Jerusalem Post. He's not a spokesperson for the Israeli government or the IDF. He's speaking as a journalist, as an analyst of what is going on. Yet Michal Hussein, the BBC journalist there, really pretty much baits him over the casualty figures. It's actually fairly disgusting, and also to term the missiles coming over as homemade rockets really just downplays the impact of what was going on. And I give credit to Gil Hoffman there for keeping us cool under what was probably a very, very trying circumstance.
And also, we've seen these type of interviews before, particularly if I look at Channel 4 News with Jon Snow. And I remember one particular interviewed the Israeli government spokesman. Sorry, his name slips my mind at the moment. It'll come back to me in a minute. But he put him under so much pressure, wouldn't even allow him to actually finish his conversation without becoming very, very aggressive. Now, you kind of see when we see these programs and we see these interviews, why doesn't the mainstream media, a lot of them, give Israel a fair chance to actually answer some of the questions or the accusations that are presented to Israel?
Well, this is it. I don't see a lot of the Palestinian spokespeople being treated the same way. They're being treated with kid gloves. But, a lot of the journalists come into these interviews trying to prove their point, their preconceived notion of Israel as being in the wrong, Israel being as the aggressor, and putting our spokespeople on defence. Of course, it's not easy to explain Israel's case. I said it's a complicated situation. But, it's time that the media actually gave Israel a fair chance.
Yeah. And also in terms of false and misleading broadcasts or articles that are misleading or factually inaccurate, isn't there a great danger that some of these reports actually lead to an increase in anti-Semitism because of the way that Israel's being demonized through some of the mainstream media?
Well, I think the statistics speak for themselves. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen in Britain, certainly, I think it's third highest incidence of anti-Semitism since records began. We've had a massive increase, I think, in the 50% plus region in France, also 30-something% increase in Belgium. Obviously, of course, there are right-wing anti-Semites out there. There always have been, but we tend to see increases in anti-Semitism at times of tension in the Middle East. The Jews who are living in Western countries, in Europe, in Britain, America, they're not responsible for what goes on in Israel. And nor should they be held responsible or blamed for the actions of the Israeli government or their fellow co-religionists abroad. After all, if something happens in the Catholic Church, for example, we don't see people screaming abuse at Italians or the Vatican, for example.
In terms of what we've been discussing so far, we've very much talked about broadcast media, but also want to now discuss the impact of photojournalism, in particular that pictures can say 1,000 words. How are photographs being manipulated to put Israel in a bad light?
Well, you have all sorts of ways of doing this. I think just in the last few days, there was actually a very good headline in the Irish Independent, which actually stated that a rocket from Gaza had struck and ceasefire had been breached. Now, you would have expected perhaps an illustrative photograph of, rocket being launched, or perhaps the landing site near Ashkelon in the south of Israel. No, there was a photo of an Israeli soldier firing a tear gas canister. Now, that's the image that's going to stick in people's minds. It's very subliminal, but it's actually very, very effective. We also see other things which people don't realize going on, the use of recycled photographs. I've seen photos of Gaza taken in 2009 in the midst of a conflict where, of course, you see scenes of destruction and people in a particularly bad way. And they've been republished maybe a year and a half later. And Gaza certainly isn't like that. Of course it doesn't look good in the middle of a battle, but that's not the situation for everyday Gazans. So people tend to get their images from these photographs that are misleading. And even things such as the angles that a photographer uses to portray how Palestinians are allegedly suffering under Israeli military, for example.
We've got a clip to go to now. It's an honest reporting clip entitled "How an Anti-Semitic Picture Has Made the News."
Hi, this is Yardine Frankel from Honest Reporting's Jerusalem office. The South African Broadcast Corporation ran a story about Israeli attempts to curb illegal immigration from Africa.
So what picture did they use that they thought would best illustrate this story about immigration? Check out their website.
Take a closer look at that outrageous picture.
It's shocking. It has nothing to do with the story. But you know what? What's even more disgusting? We saw this same picture 2 years ago used by the Washington Post.
Here is the picture from a 2010 Washington Post photo gallery. Is it a picture of a news event or simply anti-Semitism?
So where did this photo originally come from? It's a Reuters photo taken from 2 years ago, and the Reuters caption is that it's an activist at a protest.
Here's the original picture from the Reuters website, and here's their caption.
But this isn't a news photo. This is simply an anti-Semitic caricature with an anti-Israel slogan thrown on top of it that is now being used for the last 2 years again and again by the news.
If you are outraged that a news organization would use this picture, do something about it. Contact the SABC and demand that they remove this picture and apologize for publishing it.
Hello and welcome back to the Middle East Report. Son, we've got a clip to go to in a minute, and in the course of researching for this programme, it's a clip that your organisation, Honest Reporting, put together, shows how a photographer has manipulated the image he was taking of some Palestinian children, putting them on a fence and showing that actually these are prisoners with a caption. It just shows you that how are so many photographers or even newspapers for carrying these pictures able to get away with this?
Well, a lot of the time, there's a couple of different issues going on here. We have Palestinian photographers on the ground, of course. Then you have the incidents that take place that are actually caused by the media being there. For example, stoning of Israeli cars. A lot of the time, these things don't take place until there's actually a photojournalist there to take the photos and encourage the people to start, the Palestinians to start throwing stones or attacking Israelis. Of course, a lot of photojournalists like to do particularly arty type photos, and a lot of the time they don't portray Israel in a particularly good light. I remember, I think the last World Cup, the Football World Cup, we had scenes of photographs of goalposts against the background of Israel's security barrier, for example. These are things that, quite frankly, they didn't really have much to do with football at all, but they had a lot to do with propagandizing.
We've got a clip to go to now that looks at how photographs are being manipulated to convey a completely different reality that is only designed to demonize Israel.
Hi, this is Yardane Frankel from Honest Reporting's Jerusalem office. On June 20th, 2010, a Gaza-based freelance photographer went to an anti-Israel protest rally at an industrial area of the Gaza Strip. However, the picture that he took was not terribly exciting. It showed how few people were at this anti-Israel rally. But one thing caught his eye. Notice the gate on the right-hand side of the picture. The photographer had children stand behind that gate holding a protest sign. But even this was not terribly compelling. So then he had the children stand behind the bars and stick their arms through it, and then he took the picture from an angle. The result made it seem like these children were actually in a prison. Now, in the caption that he used, he put, "This is a picture of a demonstration, not of a prison," but a newspaper doesn't have to use the caption that a photographer submits. So when The Independent decided to run an article about Palestinian minors who were detained by Israel, they talked about children clapped in irons, and then they ran this photo with no caption. How would anyone looking at this article know that these are not children in an Israeli prison? What's really outrageous is The Independent used this same picture 2 years ago, and now we find it cropping up on all sorts of articles and opinion pieces that slam Israel. Here it is in Australia's The Age. So what can you do about it? Contact The Independent at the email address on the screen or in the description and demand that they stop using these staged photos.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Simon, when I just look at that very, very good clip, but also very, very disturbing clip, and the fact that the Independent chose to actually run with this photograph, doesn't this actually bring their own credibility as a newspaper into dispute by actually showing pictures that are actually fake or misleading?
It does, but of course it only does if someone's actually watching for these things. I mean, over the years, I've seen some incredible stuff. I had no idea that this sort of manipulation was going on until we actually we hired a former photojournalist from London who's now living in Israel, a guy with many, many years of expertise, and he actually sat and went through hundreds and hundreds of the photographs from Reuters, the Associated Press, Getty Images, and he was able to analyse and show how these things have been manipulated, and it was a real eye-opener.
And one thing we've seen very, very recently, and it's made quite a lot of news headlines this year, has been the rise of anti-Semitic cartoons. I particularly think of the Gerald Scarfe cartoon in the Sunday Times back on January, which appeared on Holocaust Memorial Day, that really reenacted the medieval blood libel. And then we've seen another picture supplied by Honest Reporting with a Guardian cartoon. Why are we starting to see cartoonists really start to portray kind of anti-Semitic caricatures of the Jewish people in Israel?
Well, I don't just think it's the cartoonists, but the fact that these things are actually getting past the editors into the newspapers themselves. I think what we're seeing here is, I don't believe that there's necessarily anti-Semitic intent. However, the result is, and what it means is that anti-Semitic tropes are now becoming mainstream. So here we see, for example, the Gerald Scarfe cartoon. Now, of course, that it was published on Holocaust Memorial Day made it doubly worse. But what I would say about this is simply that, from my point of view as the managing editor of Honest Reporting, this cartoon is simply wrong any day of the week. And we would have responded whether it was on Holocaust Memorial Day or any other day, because it simply portrayed Israel inaccurately and offensively.
But doesn't something like that, because I read the Sunday Times and get that newspaper. Now sometimes when you're going through there's big advertisements in the paper, there's very gripping photographs, but you're always then drawn to the cartoons when you get to the editorial page. And isn't it that someone who's maybe not actually interested in what happens in Israel or interested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict sees that picture and then just associates in their mind that here Israel's the aggressor, they're oppressing Palestinians, and it reinforces a lot of those lies and misinformation regarding Israel, and also demonises the Israeli Prime Minister. And surely a picture like that should actually be made of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
That's a good point, and those are very, very powerful images, cartoons. Certainly, with the linkage there with blood, of course, made it particularly nasty. And I think also editors have to realise, is it offensive to Jews? Forget whether Israelis don't like it or not, if it's a criticism of their policies. But this was offensive to the Jewish community, irrespective of whether individual Jewish people agree with Benjamin Netanyahu's policies or not.
And we've got another cartoon to go to now, and this is taken from the Guardian. And what I find disturbing about this picture, Simon, is there you've got the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying "Vote Likud" with the rockets in the background. You've got very, very clearly what is Israeli flags made to look like rockets, and there he's standing in front, and he's got a puppet of Tony Blair and William Hague, as if he's the great puppet master. Now, surely cartoons like this conjure up images of the elders of Zion. It's actually the Jewish people controlling the world, and surely this is very insidious cartoon.
It is very insidious. I mean, it's a particularly nasty trope. In that particular example, of course, the charge was that Benjamin Netanyahu had called elections on the back of a military campaign. Now, of course, the Western media got it completely wrong because, in fact, Netanyahu's party actually lost seats in the election as the Israeli electorate moved to the centre rather than to the right, which was what people were expecting.
And in terms of reaction, I mean, sometimes when we see cartoons like the Joe Scarf cartoon in the Sunday Times, it just creates a revulsion. And sometimes when we switch on our mainstream channels to get some news, and you get angry because you see this misconception that Israel is portrayed in a very bad light, or there's wrong information, or the story doesn't have any context to it. Thankfully, I've got an outlet for that because I've got my program here on the Middle East Report, so are able to put Israel's case forward. But what can some of our viewers who are very concerned about the way that Israel's treated by some of the mainstream media in this country?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to actually make your views known, because if the media aren't criticised or critiqued, then of course they're going to continue doing this. Obviously, the best thing to do is educate yourself. So from my point of view, the best thing for your viewers to do would be to go to our website at www.honestreporting.com and subscribe. It's free, and you'll get regular communiques in your inboxes, alerting you to issues of media bias and actually how you can respond, giving you the information that you need.
Yeah, my wife did that after the last program we did. So she subscribed and then says, "Oh, you've seen this, you've seen this." So it's very good that we have emails now, and things can actually go viral as well. And maybe we can actually hold some of our newspapers and media corporations to account purely because we're interested in truth. I mean, on this program here, I would say that we are biased in terms of Israel, because we have a passion and a heart and a love for Israel and the Jewish people, and want to convey the truth. And if you want to see turn on the other mainstream channels, then you get a different perspective. But I personally feel that Israel doesn't get that fair representation. The Israeli government spokespeople don't get the chance to say what Israel's position, and the majority of the mainstream media don't really get to give their viewers the real insight into what the real Israel is like and the challenges that Israel and the Jewish people face.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, we see a lot of the time that when ordinary people actually come and visit Israel, they have a completely different view of what the country's about, because what you see on your media is not a realistic portrayal of what Israel is.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's very, very important. I know particularly that the Jewish community are very, very concerned when they see alarming cartoons like the Gerald Scarf one in the Sunday Times, also coming from such a newspaper with so much reputation and so much influence as the Sunday Times. Is certainly the best quality newspaper in this country, and certainly they have the best journalists working for them. But thankfully, Rupert Murdoch, the owner of News Corporation, came out very, very quickly against this. Do you think the way the Sunday Times handled this was correct? Because having worked with many journalists, and I would have thought they would have thought, we got this cartoon, it's not particularly nice, it's controversial, but in our magazine we did a complete expose on some of the myths and lies regarding the what happened during the Holocaust, and so therefore maybe they thought that this was in the magazine, they could get away with it.
Well, I think it's simply wrong to make any sort of equivalences between the use of the Holocaust and what's going on in Israel. These two things are not intimately linked. Of course, the Jewish people went through a particularly appalling trauma, 6 million dead Jews, and as a result of Nazism. But to start comparing Israel to the Nazis is, under European Union definition of anti-Semitism, it's anti-Semitic. And it's no excuse to say, well, we balance things with a nice piece about the Holocaust, because that doesn't make up for the fact that the particular cartoon was offensive. I give credit to the Sunday Times. They held their hands up eventually. They apologised. This is not something we see from every media outlet. For example, The Guardian, very, very rare that The Guardian will even admit that there's a problem. And in those rare times that they have admitted that there's a problem, that certain things that they've written or cartoons they've produced may be perceived as anti-Semitic, it's carried on. Even after The Guardian has actually said we need to be more careful, it still carries on. I think there's a particularly vicious streak in some of the media here, particularly in The Guardian.
Yeah, I mean, having looked at many of the Guardian's photographs. And when it comes down to Israel, there's a very striking thing that appears. You often see a lot of Palestinian children, women, and elderly Palestinians, but you see Israeli soldiers, but you never see their face. They very, very rarely show ordinary Israelis in their pictures, almost deliberately. And isn't this very worrying, just as much as a negative or false media report to actually show pictures that are misleading? Isn't that also something that needs to be confronted?
Well, absolutely. And in terms of the dehumanization of Israelis, I mean, for example, taking the Israeli soldiers, these are a bunch of 18, 19-year-old kids. They're also scared. They don't want to be standing at a checkpoint. They're worried that someone's going to put a gun or a knife on them. And in the end, because Israel has universal conscription, these are our kids. They've been brought up in the right way. They have their own human, decent values system. And we sometimes forget that these are not people that join the army because, they have an urge to go around, shooting. These are people that are defending their kids, their parents, and their country.
Simon, we're down to less than 2 minutes of the programme. Do you have a message for our viewers you'd like to convey?
The message is all is not lost. Certainly go and subscribe to Honest Reporting and educate yourselves. And also take the time to look critically at your media. When you read the story, when you see the headline, don't just take it for granted that what you're reading is the completely accurate portrayal of Israel. Think for yourselves and also take action and let the media know when you think that they've got it wrong.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. We've got about a minute left, Simon. So I want to thank you very much again for being my guest today on the Middle East Report and for the excellent work that you're doing through Honest Reporting in really countering the lies and the misinformation that are presented by Israel in the mainstream media and actually to provide a check and balance, which I think is very important. I think it's important to work with journalists to engage with them, but it's also important that they know that if they've produced a false report, that there are people monitoring what they're doing.
Absolutely, and thank you as well for Revelation TV for giving us the opportunity to actually put our message out on air when in a lot of places we're just not able to.
That's an absolute pleasure. And I really want to thank you for watching today's programme. We can see here in this programme today, when it comes down to the mainstream media, there is a real battle. And that battle is for truth. And it's important that the truth of Israel is conveyed. And thanks to Revelation TV, here on the Middle East Report, we can actually put Israel's side of the story, which is sadly not heard in the mainstream media. So let's continue to stand with Israel. Let's continue to pray for Israel and the Jewish people that the truth of her situation will be told. And thank you for watching today's programme.